It's an absolutely gripping read, and I recommend everybody go to Business Week and pick up this story because it gives you a sense of the hacking effort by the Chinese government to get into hardware. So often when we're talking about cybersecurity, we're talking about software, zeros and ones, but the allegation in this story is that it was ultimately tiny little microchips that were implanted in motherboards that were built in China by subcontractors that were then sent into American firms' products and then went on to high-level government and corporate offices around the country. So the idea here is that because the Chinese control so much of the global supply chain for electronic components, the Chinese military, the People's Liberation Army, was able to install these tiny, tiny microchips that could open sort of Trojan horse-style back doors into the hardware itself that's in these data centers around the country, and that would allow Chinese hackers to open the door and get in. So a fascinating account here, and equally fascinating, Carl, I think, are the denials. Very specific, very intense by these companies. Business Week, which is a very good magazine where I happen to have worked once in my career, they say they've got 17 different sources. They cite sources inside the government, inside the companies, refuting the company's denials. So it is really a remarkable piece of journalism here this morning.
Yeah, you know, Eamon, you've covered it obviously very closely as we read Amazon's statement there. I covered it a number of years ago for some period of time rather closely, which is the Chinese effort to infiltrate U.S. corporations was done at a very high level with perhaps tens of thousands of employees. Unclear how much that effort continues today, but this would seem to fit a pattern, would it not?
Sure. I'll give you an example. Just last week on Tuesday, the Department of Justice put out a press release announcing that they had arrested a 27-year-old Chinese citizen in Chicago. The allegation made by the U.S. government was that this Chinese citizen was acting at the behest of Chinese intelligence, trying to recruit engineers and scientists in American companies for Chinese intelligence. This was just last week. The allegation was that a lot of these engineers and scientists were working inside U.S. defense contractors as well as other companies. So this is an ongoing, very robust effort by the Chinese government to get inside access into U.S. government agencies and U.S. corporations. And of course, that underpins part of what the Trump administration has been saying about Chinese intellectual property theft. The Chinese, they allege, are trying to catch up to the United States in terms of its technological and economic edge around the world by simply stealing stuff. They can't innovate as fast as we can, the United States believes, but they can steal faster than we can innovate. And so that's how you catch up if you're the #2 global superpower in the economy.
Yeah. And then in the next hour, Eamon, the vice president's going to give a speech about some charges about election meddling that the president brought up last week, is apparently going to talk about efforts that the Chinese made, for example, denying a license to a major U.S. company if they refuse to speak out against White House trade policy, sort of the qualitative measures we've talked about being possible for a long time.
Right. That's so interesting because this Bloomberg Business Week piece today sort of emphasizes the degree to which American intelligence knows about this kind of thing for years. According to this account, back as early as 2014 or even earlier, U.S. intelligence was on to some of this, but it took them a long time to trace it back to the source and really prove their case that this is what was going on. Just last week, you heard the president make this allegation that the Chinese are currently trying to manipulate the U.S. midterm elections in November. I asked the president last week in New York directly if he had any evidence that he could share of that allegation to back up a dramatic allegation against the Chinese government. And the president told me, no, you know, I don't have any evidence I can put out yet, but we will be putting it out soon. So maybe there is something behind the scenes that the president's aware of that we haven't seen yet on that, and we'll wait for the U.S. government to put out some details.